Hello everyone, welcome to and welcome back to my channel, Book Time with Elvis, with me, Mark. I do hope very much that you're doing well. And welcome back to this Historathon inspired read aloud of the Reverend James Bakey's Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt. And if you're unaware by now, you shouldn't be of course, there is a fantastic year-long event called Historathon 2023, which is underway. It's hosted by Vin at Revenant Reads and contains a wonderful horde of co-hosts, of which I am lucky to include myself among them. The year is split into 4 parts, each part 3 months long. The first part, of which this is included, is Prehistory-500 AD. Right then, let's carry on. We are on chapter 6 and child life in ancient Egypt. How did boys and girls live in this quaint old land so many hundreds of years ago? Well, hundreds of years ago, eh? How were they dressed? What sort of games did they play at? What sort of lessons did they learn? And what kind of school did they go to? If you could have lived in Egypt in those far-off days, you would have found many differences between your life of today and the life that the Egyptian children led, but you would also have found that there were very many things much the same then as they are now. Boys and girls were boys and girls 3,000 years ago, just as they are now, and you would find that they did very much the same things and even played very much the same games as you do today. When you read in your fairy stories about a little boy or girl, you often hear that they had fairy godmothers who came to their cradles and gave them gifts and foretold what was going to happen to the little babies in after years. Well, when little Tahuti or little Sen-Semb was born in Thebes 1500 years before Christ, there were fairy godmothers too, who presided over the great event, and there were others called the Hathors who foretold all that was going to happen to the little boy or girl as the years went on. The baby was kept a baby much longer in those days than our little ones are kept. The happy mother nursed the little thing carefully for 3 years at all events, carrying it about her wherever she went, either on her shoulder or astride upon her hip. If baby took ill and the doctor was called in, the medicines that were given were not in the least like the sugar-coated pills and capsules that make medicine taking easy nowadays. The Egyptian doctor did not know a very great deal about medicine and sickness, but he made up for his ignorance by the nastiness of the doses which he gave to his patients. I don't think he would like to take pills made up of the moisture scraped from pig's ears, lizard's blood, bad meat and decaying fat, to say nothing of still nastier things. Often the doctor would look very grave and say, "The child is not ill, he is bewitched." And then he would sit down and write out a prescription, something like this. Remedy to drive away bewitchment. Take a great beetle, cut off his head and his wings, boil him, put him in oil and lay him out, then cook his head and his wings, put them in snake fat, boil, and let the patient drink the mixture. Oh, my goodness. What is it they say, that the cure is worse than the disease, eh? Maybe? I think you would almost rather take the risk of being bewitched than drink a dose like that. Sometimes the doctor gave no medicines at all, but wrote a few magic words on a scrap of old paper and tied it round the part where the pain was. I dare say it did as much good as his pills. Very often the mother believed that it was not really sickness that was troubling her child, but that a ghost was coming and haunting him, and hurting him rather. So when his cries showed that the ghost was in the room, his mother would rise up shaking all over, I dare say, and would repeat the verse that she had been taught would drive ghosts away. Comest thou to kiss this child, I suffer thee not to kiss him. Comest thou to quiet him, I suffer thee not to quiet him. Comest thou to harm him, I suffer thee not to harm him. Comest thou to take him away, I suffer thee not to take him away. When little Tahuti had got over his baby aches and escaped the ghosts, he begins to run about and play. He and his sister are not bothered to any great extent with dressing in the mornings. They are very particular about washing, but as Egypt is so hot, clothes are not needed very much. And so the little boy and girl play about with nothing at all on their little brown bodies, except perhaps a narrow girdle or even a single thread tied round the waist. They have their toys just like you. Tahuti has got a wonderful man who, when you pull a string, works a roller up and down upon a board, just like a baker rolling out dough, and besides, he has a crocodile that moves its jaws. His sister has dolls, a fine Egyptian lady, and a frizzy-haired, black-faced Nubian girl. Sometimes they played together at ninepins, rolling the ball through the little gate. For about 4 years this would go on, as long as Tahuti was what the Egyptians called a wise little one. Then, when he was 4 years old, the time came when he had to become a writer in the house of books, which is what the Egyptians called a schoolboy. So little Tahuti set off for school, still wearing no more clothes than the thread tied around his waist, and with his black hair plaited up into a long thin lock, which hung down over his right ear. The first thing that he had to learn was how to read and write, and this was no easy task, for Egyptian writing, though it is very beautiful when well done, is rather difficult to master. All the more as there were two different styles which had to be learned if a boy was going to become a man of learning. I don't suppose that you would think your old copybooks of much importance when you are done with them, but the curious thing is that among all the books that have come down to us from ancient Egypt, there are far more old copybooks than any others, and these books, with the teacher's corrections written on the margins and rough sketches scratched in here and there among the writing, have proved most valuable in telling us what the Egyptians learned and what they liked to read, for a great deal of the writing consisted in the copying out of wise words of men of former days, and sometimes of stories of the old times. These old copybooks can speak to us in one way, but if they could speak in another, I dare say they would tell us of many weary hours in school, and of many floggings and tears, for the Egyptian schoolmaster believed with all his heart in the cane, and used it with great vigour, and as often as he could. Little Tahuti used to look forward to his daily flogging, much as he did to his lunch in the middle of the day, when his careful mother regularly brought him 3 rolls of bread and 2 jugs of beer. Did I read that right? Did I read that right? Little Tahuti used to look forward to his daily flogging, much as he did to his lunch in the middle of the day. All right, each to their own, I suppose. 3 rolls of bread and 2 jugs of beer. Right, okay. A boy's ears, his master used to say, are on his back, and he hears when he is beaten. One of the former pupils at his school, writing to his teacher and recalling his school days, says, "I was with thee since I was brought up as a child. Thou didst beat my back, and thine instructions went into my ear. Sometimes the boys, if they were stubborn, got punishments even worse than the cane." Another boy, in a letter to his old master, says, "Thou hast made me buckle since the time that I was one of thy pupils. I spent my time in the lock-up and was sentenced to 3 months and bound in the temple. I'm afraid our schoolboys would think the old Egyptian teachers rather more severe than the masters with whom they have to do nowadays." Lesson time occupied about half the day, and when it came to an end, the boys all ran out of school shouting for joy. That custom has not changed much. Anyway, in all these hundreds of years, I don't think that they had any home lessons to do, and so perhaps their school time was not quite so bad as we might imagine from the rough punishments they used to get. When Tahuti grew a little older and had fairly mastered the rudiments of writing, his teacher set him to work out copies of different passages from the best-known Egyptian books, partly to keep up his handwriting and partly to teach him to know good Egyptian and to use correct language. Sometimes it was a piece of a religious book that he was set to copy, sometimes a poem, sometimes a fairy tale, for the Egyptians were very fond of fairy tales, and later on, perhaps we may hear some of the stories. Oh, that would be exciting, won't it? Yeah. The oldest fairy stories in the world. But generally, the piece that was chosen was one which would not only exercise the boy's hand, but teach him a good style, but would also help to teach him good manners, and fill his mind with right ideas. Very often, Tahuti's teacher would dictate to him a passage from the wise advice which a great king of long ago left to his son, the crown prince, or from some other book of the same kind, and sometimes the exercises would be in the form of letters which the master and his pupils wrote as though they had been friends far away from one another. Tahuti's letters, you may be sure, were full of wisdom and of good resolutions, and I dare say he was just about as fond of writing them as you are of writing the letters that your teacher sometimes sets as a task for you. When it came to arithmetic, Tahuti was so far lucky that the number of rules he had to learn was very few. The master taught him addition and subtraction, and a very slow and clumsy form of multiplication, but he could not teach him division for the very simple reason that he did not properly understand it himself. Enough of the mensuration was taught him to enable him to find out, though rather roughly, what was the size of a field and how much corn would go into a granary of any particular size. And when he had learned these things, his elementary education was pretty well over. Of course, a great deal would depend on the profession he was going to follow. If he was going to be only a common scribe, his education would go no farther. For the work he would have to do would need no greater learning than reading, writing, and arithmetic. If he was going to be an officer in the army, he entered as a cadet in a military school, which was attached to the royal stables. But if he was going to be a priest, he had to join one of the colleges which belonged to the different temples of the gods, and there, like Moses, he was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was taught all the strange ideas which they had about the gods and the life after death, and the wonderful worlds above and below, where the souls of men lived after they had finished their lives on earth. But whether his schooling was carried on to what we should call a university training or not, there was one thing that Tahuti was taught with the utmost care, and that was to be very respectful to those who were older than himself, never to sit down while an older person was standing in the room, and always to be very careful in his manners. Chief of the older people to whom he had to show respect were his parents, and above all his mother. For Egyptians reverence their mothers more than anyone else in the world. Here is a little scrap of advice that a wise old Egyptian once left to his son. Thou shalt never forget what thy mother has done for thee. She bare thee and nourished thee in all manner of ways. She nursed thee for 3 years. She brought thee up, and when thou didst enter the school, and wast instructed in the writings, she came daily to thy master with bread and beer from her house. If thou forgettest her, she might blame thee. She might lift up her hands to God, and he would hear her complaint. Children nowadays might do a great deal worse than remember these wise words of the oldest book in the world. There you go. But you are not to think that Egyptian children's life was all teaching and prim behaviour. When Tahuti got his holidays, he would sometimes go out with his father and mother and sister on a fishing or fowling expedition. If they were going fishing, the little papyrus skiff was launched and the party paddled away, armed with long thin spears, which had 2 prongs at the point. Drifting over the quiet shallow waters of the marshy lakes, they could see the fish swimming beneath them and launch their spears at them. Sometimes, if he was lucky, Tahuti's father would pierce a fish with either prong of the spear, and then there was great excitement. But still more interesting was the fowling among the marshes. The spears were laid aside on this kind of expedition, and instead Tahuti and his father were armed with curved throwing sticks, shaped something like an Australian boomerang. But besides the throw sticks, they had with them a rather unusual helper. When people go shooting nowadays, they take dogs with them to retrieve the game. Well, the Egyptians had different kinds of dogs too, which they used for hunting. But when they went fowling, they took with them a cat, which was trained to catch the wounded birds and bring them to her master. The little skiff was paddled cautiously across the marsh, and in among the reeds, where the wild ducks and other waterfowl lived, Senseb and her mother holding on to the tall papyrus plants and pulling them aside to make room for the boat, or plucking the beautiful lotus lilies of which the Egyptians were so fond. When the birds rose, Tahuti and his father let fly their throw sticks, and when a bird was knocked down, the cat, which had been sitting quietly on the bow of the boat, dashed forward among the reeds and secured the fluttering creature before it could escape. Well, this is fascinating to me, I have to say. I didn't know really you could train cats properly like that. Interesting. Altogether, it was great fun for the brother and sister, as well as for the grown folks and Tahuti and Sensab, like nothing so well as when the gaily painted little skiff was launched for a day on the marshes. I think that, on the whole, they had a very bright and happy life in these days, and that, though they had not many of the advantages that you have today, the boys and girls of 3,000 years ago managed to enjoy themselves in their own simple way, quite as well as you do now. Oh, charming. Very nice. So, gosh, right. I guess next time we'll look at Chapter 7, which are some fairy tales of long ago. So I think that would be interesting too. I really enjoyed this. I know not so many people are watching it, but I hope you don't mind that I do kind of indulge sometimes in the things I really like to do, which is this. I think it's nice to try and bring this, out into the world. And if it's only 5 people watching it, well, I hope the 5 of you enjoy it. All right, everybody. Until next time, do take care. Bye for now.